Hey everybody, and welcome to chapter number 7. We're going to be covering encoding, storage, and retrieval in this video. And so if you haven't seen the previous video, which is over chapter 6, which is the first unit on memory, definitely, absolutely check that one out, because so much of what we're going to be talking about is going to be informed based on the kind of structure of memory that we talked about in that video. So let's go ahead and get into it. I got a couple of videos that I want to share with you today. Primarily this one right here about remembering the first 100 digits of pi we're going to be doing together. So I'm going to hold that one off for a little bit. I'll mention some of these others as we talk. I think they're fun though. I think especially, like this one with Chaser the Border Collie, who was a dog, rest in power, Chaser. She knew like over 800 something words, maybe 1,000 different words. Her vocabulary was huge, and I think kind of it offers a really interesting insight into non-human memory. And there's some other examples too, but yeah, just if you're interested in what we talk about in this video, some of these in the lecture slides might strike your interest as well. So what are we talking about today? Today we are going to be talking about the 3 stages of memory. We're going to be talking a lot then about why the context in which you remember something matters for your ability to retrieve that information later. We'll be talking about mnemonics and memory tricks. So we'll be talking about the strategies that memory champions of the world use to impress us with their feats of strength. We'll be talking about how long long-term memory actually is. It's got long in the title, but what does that actually mean? Exactly how long are we talking about here? And then we'll kind of wrap things up by talking about amnesia and implicit memory. And again, we talked about a lot of these things a little bit in chapter 6, but we're going to be really diving deep into them now. So, encoding, storage, and retrieval, this is the kind of the model for how we talk about memories coming in, staying in, and leaving our brain. That is a really oversimplified way of talking about it, but essentially what we're talking about here is that when we are encoding something, what that means is that we are taking information and we're putting it into our brain. Now, we're not at the point where we can like take a USB drive and just stick that, in our heads, but so we're mostly just talking about like things that we see, things that we hear, things that we smell. All of this stuff is we experience it, and it's going to end up in our brain. That is the process of encoding. Storage then is going to be your brain's ability to maintain that information, to hold on to it, to store it somewhere, to consolidate it, and to let it stay there until you need it later. And retrieval is later. That is whenever you go and retrieve that memory. And I don't want to use the word retrieve because that's circular, right? But like your ability to recall that information, your ability to act upon something. I'm going to say that this doesn't have to be a conscious thing. It can be unconscious when we retrieve something. All right, so we're going to be talking about each of these 3 steps, so let's get into it. The first step here, as I mentioned, was encoding. So we are looking at converting something that we experience into a usable format. Now, I love this terminology, usable format. This is, kind of an example of how cognitive psychology can be a little bit too computer, focused in its language, because we think about the brain as kind of a machine, that does its thing, a computer that that can interact with information. So what does it mean for it to be a usable format? Do we mean like converting what you see into a PDF or into like a PPTX or whatever? No, what we really mean here is that we're just transducing that experience into a neural signal. So in chapter 2, when we were talking about when we see something and how the photoreceptors convert that image, that ray of light, we convert it into something that our brain can understand. That's what we mean by usable format. So I know it's a little kind of, metaphorical language here, but that's what we mean when we are talking about that. So we're transducing it into a neural signal, into action potentials, into neurotransmitters, because that is what our brain can understand and can pass on to other areas of the brain. Encoding is extremely selective. We typically are going to prioritize the information around us that is meaningful or that we are paying a lot of attention to. I skipped over emotional because I kind of combine these things, that when we talk about something being meaningful, that it is emotional, and generally things that are emotional, well, they're emotional because they are meaningful to us. So the things that we encode, the things that really kind of stick with us, are going to be the things that we have some meaning ascribed to, that we can understand how it impacts us, how it affects us, how it fits into our understanding of the world, and it is something that we are paying attention to. So attention is crucial for our ability to encode, and you may remember from last chapter we talked about the levels of processing and how the things that are meaningful, that those typically stick with us longer. And also that whenever we spend a lot of time encoding and firing up our prefrontal cortex, that those memories are the ones that typically stick with us longer. So what does it mean for something to stick with us? That's what we are talking about when we talk about storage. So storage is our ability to hold information over time. So this is maintaining that information after it has initially been encoded. Now this is really, really tricky because it's tempting to think of encoding as like, okay, once you experience something and then you were able to get it into your brain, then it's fine. Then you can leave it alone and you can go and memorize other things. But that's not how memory works, unfortunately. Memory is dynamic, so memory is constantly changing. And one of the and we're going to talk a lot about this in chapter 8 when we talk about false memories and eyewitness testimony and things like that, that the nature of memory is very slippery. That memory, every time you access a memory, you run the possibility of distorting that memory. And the reason why is because whenever you access a memory that has been stored, you are bringing it back up out of storage, however you want to conceptualize that, and you then have the opportunity, the availability of potentially taking other information and storing it with that memory. So I'm being a little bit abstract here. Here's an example. So let's say that I am telling a story about how, like, this is a real example, so I hope my parents are not watching, that whenever I was young, I put a bunch of candy in my brother's ear canal just to kind of see, he was on board with this, by the way. Like, he thought it was interesting too. This was part of our experiments. Like, I would just put a bunch of nerd candies in his ear, and we had to go to the hospital to flush it out, because he got a bunch of candy in his ear. And so my parents tell the story, and when they tell this story, they, would talk about my brother doing it. And the story that they would tell started out with, like, first it was me putting the candy in the ear, and then it became just my brother doing it, until now when they tell that story, I'm not even really involved in this story, even though I was the one who did it. And this is a confession, which is okay because it's past the statute of limitations for this thing. But the reason why I bring this up is because every time they would talk about this story, the next time they would talk about it, it was a little bit different. And it was, and it was shaped based on whenever they would talk about it after retrieving it the next time. So even if you remember something perfectly, it doesn't mean that when you go to retrieve it the next time that it's going to stay perfect. And there's a lot of debate over essentially like how many times you can retrieve information before it's susceptible to being corrupted in some way. This is part of the reason why whenever people are giving eyewitness testimony, it's very common these days for people to, before court, especially for really emotionally charged events, that they'll have on camera somebody talking about their experience and what they saw, what they heard, and so that tape can be played later in court because we know that the more you are asked about information, the more likely you are to distort that information in some way. But again, and this gets in some really contentious territory that we can argue over and have a lot of debate over. But I'll save that for chapter 8, where we will really talk about things like eyewitness testimony and why, if you're working in the criminal justice field, you should be very, very careful with eyewitness testimony, how it's collected and how it's interpreted. Okay. Storage, the reason why it's a little bit tricky is because it is vulnerable to some of the methods that cause us to forget things. Some of these processes, which are known as decay and interference. We'll be talking about both of those a little bit later in this video. Now, I use the word retrieval a lot. Retrieval is this third stage. This is memory in action. It is the final stage of memory. This is whenever we are going to recall that information. We're taking it back out of our brain and we can act on it. We don't need it to be conscious. Sometimes people talk about it like it does need to be conscious, but like riding your bike is an example of retrieving a memory, and you don't need to be conscious about that. You probably, if you're playing an instrument, you don't need to be conscious about what you're doing. It can be kind of quote-unquote automatic. Again, we'll be talking about that a little bit later today too, but basically your retrieval is your ability to act on what you have remembered. So it relies on something that you have seen or heard or experienced or felt that allows you to retrieve it. So that can be an internal trigger or it can be an external trigger. So for example, if I'm thinking about like trying to think of an example that's not too esoteric, but like if somebody says, I'm trying to think of an example for me. If somebody says, this is so stupid. If somebody says like the word squid, I might think of Squidward, right? Because Squidward is a memory that I have of a cartoon that I watched growing up, and so the word squid is an external cue, it's a retrieval cue that is going to then make me think about Squidward. So that is an example of an external trigger, where I hear a word and that causes me to think of things. And it can also be internal. So it could be that maybe I'm just thinking to myself and I'm like daydreaming a little bit, and I'm thinking about, wow, octopuses are really smart. Yeah, and they got all those tentacles and like, oh yeah, tentacles like, I guess kind of like squids, like giant squids, and like, I guess kind of like Squidward. And so in that case, I'm still retrieving Squidward as a memory, but this was more internal, right? Where basically my kind of thought flow ended up there. But it can also be like if you're hungry for something, you're feeling achy, maybe you're feeling a little sick. All these things might be these internal cues that cause you to think of something. So a retrieval cue does not need to be purely external. And generally, our ability to retrieve information is going to be best whenever the situation is closest to when we encoded some information. And I want to really, really focus on this idea here, because this is where the next section of this video takes us. So as we chart our course here, I mentioned implicit memories. We talked about this very briefly last video, but we're going to be kind of diving into the differences between explicit and implicit memory. So as a reminder, explicit memory, this is what you can talk about. This is memory that you can put into words. Implicit memory being things you can't put into words. So I was using riding a bike or playing an instrument as an example of an implicit memory, because you don't need to actually think deliberately and voluntarily about those things. You don't need to be able to put them into words in order to act on them. So they don't have to be quote unquote conscious. Whenever you're tying your shoe, you don't have to be, you can be almost asleep and tie your shoe. And yet you're still retrieving information in order to be able to do that. So it is a form of retrieval. It does not need to be conscious. Okay, so we're going to be touching on each of these as we explore this video, but I was mentioning context for memory, so let's get into that first. So one of the big lessons that I hope you internalize from these chapters is that the retrieval context matters a lot for your ability to remember things. So our ability to recall information can be helped or hurt by the context that we find ourselves in. So I mentioned last video about how sometimes we talk about when we are learning something, we call that the study phase. And that when we are retrieving something, we sometimes call that the test phase. So you want to have your study circumstances as close as possible to your testing circumstances, because if they are really close, it allows for really easy retrieval. And the reason for that is because essentially the closer these two things are, the more retrieval cues you are going to have in order to access that. So for example, let's say that you are taking an exam for this class. So my advice for people whenever they're doing that is whatever condition you are in right now where you are watching this video, if you are watching and listening to this video, thank you so much for doing that. I would recommend that you take a quick note of your circumstances right now. Are you listening to music? Are you in a room by yourself, or are you like in your dining room where people can come in and out? Is it during the day or is it at night? Are you drinking something, or are you snacking on anything? Are you taking notes with a computer? All of these things might be relevant because all of those things might serve as retrieval cues for you. So let's say that now whenever you go to take the exam on this, if you're sitting at that dining room table and you got your snacks in front of you, just like when you watch this video, it might be the case that you get a question on the exam that is about retrieval cues, and you think to yourself like, oh, I don't remember anything about that. And then you look around and you see your bowl of snacks. Maybe it's, like some smart food popcorn or whatever, that you're grazing on that, and you think like, oh yeah, I remember Alex talked about that in his video as a potential retrieval cue. That's what retrieval cues are. So in that case, you have created a retrieval cue just from the environment around you. This is one of the things that I think is kind of a bummer about online classes, is that usually it means that or whenever you're taking an exam in person, you have that added benefit that where you heard that information or where you did those interactive experiments or activities in class, that you're encoding the rest of the class and the people around you as all potential retrieval cues, so that when you're taking that exam, you can think like, oh yeah, I remember that clock. I looked at that clock whenever I was doing this activity, and that helps retrieve that information for you. If you're listening to a playlist of music, while you're studying, maybe use that same playlist while you're taking the exam, because maybe there's a song that you, without being consciously aware of it, have associated with some information from this unit. And so when you hear that song or hear that lyric, it helps you recall that information. So that the opposite is true, that the more dissimilar the context is from study and test, the harder it might be to recall that information. Now, I was giving you examples that were very environmental in their context, right? So things that you can see directly in front of you or that you can listen to. But this is true also for emotional contexts. As we will see, when you are happy, you are more likely to recall happy memories. When you are sad, you're more likely to recall sad memories, because the emotional state of you are, if you're depressed, you're closer to maybe the events that made you depressed emotionally, and so it helps you retrieve all those really hard, hurtful memories. And that's also why when you're depressed, it can be really hard to recall all the good times, because now your emotional context between when you experience those happy times and where you're retrieving them are very, very different. So let's talk about the encoding specificity rule. So the encoding specificity rule is essentially that the likelihood that you are going to retrieve some information depends on how close that information is to how you saw it when you encoded it during original encoding. So an example of this is like flashcards. Now, I've already warned you a little bit about flashcards, because with flashcards, it's really easy for us to process them very shallowly, and based on the levels of processing from last chapter, that we process it at a structural visual level, or that we process it at an acoustic phonetic level, neither of which really help us remember that information over the long term. So you want to be careful with this, because what this means is that if you see on an exam a definition word for word, and you have to fill in the blank or whatever, That's really easy usually if you use flashcards, because the memory that you're retrieving is going to be really, really close to the same context in which it was originally encoded. So it's going to look very, very similar. So it helps with that. But if you change that wording up at all, that can really throw somebody off, right? So basically, the encoding specificity principle is that if you see something like written in cursive, for example, that whenever you go to retrieve that information, it might be helpful for you to also see it in cursive. That might help you remember that. This leads us to one of my favorite experiments to talk about because it's so insane what they did. And this is Baddeley from Baddeley and Hitch last chapter, from Baddeley and Hitch 1974, who came up with working memory. So this memory researcher, this is another one of kind of his findings. So he had people learn lists of information, and he helped, or he tested them learning these lists either on land or underwater. So really kind of strange, right? So let's take a look at what they did here. And I know it's tempting to look at the results, but I thought it might be easy to kind of talk about it when you can see all the information on the screen first. So we have, I'm going to put down here encoding. So this is essentially like the encoding phase, where they either had people study a list of items on land, or they studied that list of words underwater. So they got their scuba gear on, they're underwater, they're looking at this list of words, right? Then they're going to recall that information. And so some of them, if it's in green, they recalled that information. So this is going to be a retrieval. They retrieve that information either on land or underwater. So let's take a look at what those results look like. So what's going on with this first bar? It's the largest. So let's look at when performance is best, what's going on. Performance is best when information was encoded on land and they were tested on land. So if they got a list of words to read on land, that their retrieval was best when they were on land. Let's look at over here. These two right here seem to be kind of low. So let's see what's going on in those situations. So here what we are looking at is when people studied on land, but then had to retrieve that list of words underwater. That you can see the difference here, that this is a difference of about 14 words down to about 9 words. So about forgetting about 5 words, which doesn't seem like that much, but that is about a third of a decrease, right? That's like a 30% drop from here to here. So it matters quite a bit. It changed their performance quite a lot. If we look at over here, so those that encoded the words underwater, when they had to retrieve those words on land, which is what we saw right here, they retrieved it on land, that actually it fell. So it's not just that it's easier to retrieve it on land, because if it was, then we would expect this bar to also be up higher, but it's not. The reason why is because they studied underwater and they had to retrieve it on land, and the difference in context was enough to go down. Because when we see somebody study underwater and then be tested underwater, that accuracy is actually not so bad, right? So that's about 12, and then it drops down about 9, so it drops about 3 from here to here, whenever those contexts do not match. Now, I want to highlight something here. This is maybe the most extreme example you can have, right? Because before, I'm talking about like taking an exam in your kitchen whenever you study in your bedroom, right? Like that's a little bit of a difference in your environment. That's not nearly as drastic as being underwater versus on land, right? So this is a really extreme example here, and at this really extreme example, we're talking about the difference of missing out on 3 words or 5 words, right? So it is a 30% difference is pretty big, but it's very rare for us to be tested on something where the encoding versus retrieval might be that different. I wanted to also touch on emotional context for a little bit. We're going to be diving into this a lot next video, but I wanted to at least kind of talk about it a little bit here, about this emotional context piece, where how you are when you encode something is going to affect your ability to retrieve it a little bit later. So in a laboratory setting, that folks who, and this is a very similar kind of experiment here, they're looking at different words. They're looking at positive words, you can see in the dark kind of teal, and then negative words in the black line here. And so whenever people were happy, they were really good at recalling those positive words. When people were not feeling good, when they were depressed, they were much better at remembering the negative words. So your emotional context also matters, and you can see for the neutral words that not a huge change, but maybe some change. I guess, 50% versus 60%, so about 10% difference that, people who were feeling kind of depressed actually were a little bit better at retrieving information. I don't know what that's about. Interesting finding, though. But, we'll talk a lot more about that next chapter. So state-dependent learning, and sometimes people will draw this distinction about context-dependent learning versus state-dependent learning. Context-dependent learning is the external cues. It's like the difference between being above land and underwater. State-dependent learning is going to be how you're internally feeling. So this would be like if you are over-caffeinated versus not caffeinated. If you are wide awake versus very sleepy, or if you are really hungry versus not hungry at all. So it's easier for us to recall information whenever we are in the same physical state as well, or physiological state as well. So like you may have experienced this if you are somebody who has gone out and drank with friends before. You go to a bar and you drink. You may find that whenever you're drinking, when you become inebriated, when you're drunk, it's very likely that what you're talking about is other things that you experienced when you were drunk last time, right? Those of you that, if you've ever smoked cannabis, you know that, which is perfectly legal in Massachusetts, so knock it off, haters. Or police, whichever you are. If you're with your friends and you're getting high, what you're talking about is other things you experienced whenever you were high, basically, right? So whenever you're drunk, you're going to remember other things that happen when you're drunk. Whenever you are over-caffeinated, you're more likely to remember the things that you were experiencing when you were over-caffeinated. So the lesson to this is that if you are studying while you are drunk, that maybe you should take the exam while you are drunk. And hopefully you know that that is a joke. But I am highlighting this. Please do not do this. Please do not take the exam while you were drunk, because I don't want anybody to do that and then go to my boss and be like, hey, he told me that I should be totally shit-faced while I take the exam. And I got shit-faced, and I made a 37 out of 100. So I'm joking. So moving on. Let's talk about mnemonics then. So now's a really good point to take a break in case you want to grab a beverage or something, because we're shifting gears a little bit. So mnemonics are a way for us to help remember information. And I thought maybe a good way to introduce talking about this is to talk about catchy songs. There's a good chance that, like if you, most of you, you're in your early 20s maybe. You're in, I'm just thinking typical college age. For online programs, it's a little bit different because we have a lot of non-traditional students. But at least the students that I see in person, you got a lot of folks that are between 20 and 25 or so. And so a lot of those folks are young and they like music. And so if I ask folks, to tell me about music, you could tell me about lyrics. And it's... Song lyrics are not hard to remember compared to other things in our life. But why is that? Why is it that you can remember all the lyrics to Taylor Swift's song? Why is it that you can remember all the bars to GNX or whatever? The reason why is because the melody of that song helps remind us of what's coming up. So if you can remember the melody of a song or of a verse or something like that, then it helps you to know what information is coming up next. Now, an example of this are if you think about some of the songs that you might have used in order to remember complicated information. So when you are a baby, when you are a toddler, I should say, you're learning about the alphabet, and the alphabet is super easy, right? Everybody knows the alphabet. But when you're first starting out, it's really hard. You got to remember 26 totally random arbitrary symbols, and you have to remember them in order. That's nuts, right? If I asked you to remember the first 26 presidents in order, you'd be pissed off. You'd be like, why? That's hard. Like, there's no cues to help us know who was first, Zachary Tyler or James Polk, right? Or Martin Van Buren or Andrew Johnson or whatever, it doesn't matter. But basically, it's arbitrary. There's no way to know just looking at that list which comes first. You got to learn the sequence. And the alphabet is the same way. So what do? When we're first learning the alphabet, we learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. Now I know my ABCs, blah, 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 blah. So that is a song. That is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right? So we are teaching our kids to learn this really complex sequence, a 26-item sequence of symbols. We're teaching them to learn that using a song. So what is your excuse? You don't want to learn the first 26 presidents because you think that's hard? When you were 3 years old, you did that. You did the same thing. You just learned a song. So that is one really valid way that you can learn complicated information that's arbitrary, is to fit it into a song. Another example of this that might be a little bit more recent for you is the quadratic equation song. And some of you will remember this, some of you didn't learn it. So this might be weird for some of you. But in algebra, you're learning about how to factor out quadratic equations. And they can teach you that how to solve for x whenever you have something like this, something like that, like this equation. Like, how do you solve for x? The way that you solve for x is that x equals negative b, x equals negative b, plus or minus the square root of, plus or minus the square root of, b squared minus 4ac, b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a, where this is a, this is b, and this is c. So basically, what we mean here is that I took this equation, which is pretty hard to memorize if you're just trying to memorize it, and set it to the tune of that French nursery rhyme Frère Jacques, right? And so by remembering that song, I'm able to, even now, 20 years later, remember this equation that I've only needed to use a handful of times in my adult life, but I'm able to remember it because I remember the song. So this is an example of a mnemonic. A mnemonic is going to be any kind of learning aid or strategy or device that improves your ability to recall information because it relies on some kind of retrieval cue. So another example of this is the biological taxonomy. This might be really helpful. And so now we're looking at like using acronyms, for example, to help remember things. So thinking about the biological taxonomy, this might be something that you need whenever you're taking your biology class as part of your core curriculum. That's where I learned it. So I learned this phrase right here: kings play chess on funny green stools. What does that stand for? Well, each letter here, let's look at the first one, the K, the P, the C, the O, the F, the G, and the S. That stands for, the K is for kingdom, the P is for phylum, the C is for class, the O is for order, the F is for family, the G is for genus, and the S is for species. So whenever I start teaching this stuff, sometimes I can see the lights in people's eyes where they're like, oh man, I struggled with that in biology, and this would have been a huge help. And then I also see some people that are shaking their heads like, nah, man, that's too much work. That's too much work for just remembering this. And that's totally fine. But I promise you that if you try to remember 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, these 7 words in this order, mind you, that's the key, is that in this order too. If you try to remember these 7 words in this order, I promise you it's easier to remember a sentence that is vivid like this than it is to remember 7 totally random and arbitrary words that you need to remember in order. The same applies when we talk about acronyms like this, like Roy G. Biv. We know that the colors of the rainbow Roy G. Biv are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And if I asked you, hey, what is the sequence of the rainbow? You'd pull out Roy G. Biv to remember that, right? The same reason why you would probably use King's Play Chess on Funny Green Stools, because it's not just remembering what the colors are, it's remembering where they are in that order. One other really famous example of this, really popular one, is, this is another math one, is please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, which is also called PEMDAS, which is essentially like a Roy G. Biv thing, right? It's a we can either talk about this as a sentence or we can talk about it as an acronym. They mean the same thing. They are the order of operations for mathematics. That in both cases here, what we're talking about is the P is for parentheses, the E is for exponent, the M is for multiplication, the D is for division, the A is for addition, and the S is for subtraction. And again, the order matters. That's why we come up with these sentences. That's why we come up with these acronyms. That's why we come up with those songs. It's because it's not just can we remember this information, it's remembering that information, but also the sequence in which it occurs. So the reason why I mentioned that up is because we're going to be talking about that when we start talking about the first 100 digits of pi. Another really popular mnemonic, besides songs, besides kind of planting them as retrieval cues in sentences like this, is to develop what's called the method of loci, or the memory palace. This comes from the reason why it's loci instead of location is because we have some Greek roots here. That basically, quick little history lesson, because you're always going to get at least one little history lesson whenever you tune into these videos, I'm sorry, that basically the Greeks were known for their skills in rhetoric. They were known for their skills in oration, for being convincing, for giving really long and impassioned speeches about democracy and politics and stuff like that, because that's, you know, their whole big thing was democracy or whatever. And so they would come in and they would have like a bunch of senators, and they'd give like these, you know, hour-long speeches, and they didn't have paper like you and I have. They couldn't just write stuff down because that stuff was really expensive at the time. They couldn't just chisel the stuff. So how did they remember all these really long speeches? They didn't have teleprompters. So they would develop this method of loci, and I want to say that typically it's given to, the credit is given to, it is on the tip of my tongue, starts with a C, it's going to come to me, so I maybe shouldn't even try here. Oh, it's killing me. Alright, it doesn't matter, but it's... All right. Anyways, this senator who was known for his rhetoric at the time, basically he was imagining in this conference hall that had collapsed who everyone was based on where they were standing. So he was able to kind of mentally walk through that governance hall and imagine, based on the location of where that part of architecture was, who was standing there. So sorry, I am Googling now who invented the memory palace. Cicero. It was credits given to Cicero, that was the guy, the rhetorician. I don't think that that's actually true. It's probably apocryphal, but if it helps you remember that Cicero was involved in that, for those of you who even know who Cicero is. So let's take a look at what a memory palace consists of, because a memory palace, if you've heard of it before, and if you've seen certain, well, I'm not even going to ruin the TV shows, but there are some TV shows that they'll have villains who have these really complex memory palaces, who are able to remember these really complex things. And you don't need to be a villain to do this. You can do this yourself. You are going to do this yourself, because I'm going to teach you how in just a second. And it is going to seem like a lot of work, just like these examples here seem like a lot of work as well. And yes, they can be a lot of work, But the whole point of it is that if you put a little bit of work up front, it becomes something that is easy to remember, but also really, really long lasting as well. So you should pick out a location that is meaningful and familiar to you. I would recommend for this first example maybe using your childhood home or maybe using your high school. To me, both of those are really good starting places for something like this. You want a place that you can close your eyes and kind of walk around in and kind of imagine yourself kind of walking through. So that's why these really familiar areas are the ones that we recommend first. And this takes advantage of something that is true about the brain, which is that the human brain is really good at remembering locations like this. Now, not everybody's good at navigation and remembering where to go, right? Like some people are, maybe not as good as others in like navigating like how to drive from point A to point B. But the human brain generally has evolved to be really good at remembering the layout of structures over time like this. So that's why this stuff works, is because it's really easy for you to imagine yourself in your current apartment. Like if you were at the front door, like, and you're walking through, like how to get to the bathroom with your eyes closed, because you probably have done that in the middle of the night, right? Been able to like walk from your bedroom to the bathroom in total darkness. You're able to retain the geographical layout, and we're going to use that to our advantage here. So in order to remember something really complicated, first pick a location that is meaningful and familiar to you. And then what you'll do is you will start placing those items you're trying to remember in this location around you, so that you can then stop and then kind of recall that location and where you set those objects, and that helps you recall those items in order. Yes, this does take time to do. Yes, it is a little bit of, it is kind of hard. It is, it doesn't feel very easy at first. But, this is one of those things where, like, if you practice it a little bit, you'll get better at it. And even still, I think you'll see, if you try to do the example that I'm going to show you in 2 minutes, I think that you'll see that if you practice it a couple of times, that you can nail it after just a little bit. So don't let the initial kind of effort that it takes here make you feel like it's not working. It just takes a little bit of time for it to work. And now these days, it's just so easy for us to just like take a screenshot of something, take a picture of something, or write something down in our phones, that it feels like it's not worth it. But I promise you that some of this stuff will be worth it, because if you really want to impress an employer, for example, just show them that you pay attention, that you have a good memory. You're not going to impress them if after they say something important, you pull out your phone and you text it to yourself, right? Anyways, the next piece that I want to talk about before we use our memory palace example is what's called the PEG system. The PEG system is how a lot of these memory experts are able to get around George Miller's magical number 7 plus or minus 2. So when you see somebody who's really good at remembering stuff, it looks like magic. It looks like they're a savant. It looks like they are some kind of genius, when in fact all of these people, well, not all of them, but almost everybody who competes for like memory championship stuff, almost none of them are geniuses. None of them are savants. None of them are, like born in any kind of special way. Really what they're doing is they are employing these kind of cognitive strategies here. So like, how are they able to remember a deck of cards? Because that is one of the competitions that they have at the Memory Olympics is like how quickly can you remember a deck of cards. And I think that the time down is like to like 20 something seconds that people are able to do this. We're not good at remembering some types of information. So we're not really good at remembering arbitrary letters and numbers. So that's why like whenever you have Google suggest a password to you, it's impossible to remember, right? Our brain is just not very good if it doesn't have some kind of meaning attached to it. We need meaning attached to it. So we are good at remembering pictures and scenes, especially if they are unusual or especially if they are meaningful to us. So this system, the PEG system, which is sometimes called the master system, is going to convert numbers into letters And then from those letters, you create words, and from those words, you create vivid pictures. So I know this is a little bit of work, because we're going to be taking something like a phone number, and we're going to take that phone number, we're going to take each of those numbers, convert them into a letter, then take those letters, convert them into words, and then take those words and convert them into images, and then we can easily remember what that phone number is, just by kind of working backwards. And again, I know this sounds like a lot of work, but I'm going to show you along with this guy right here. This guy,
if you love to travel, Capital One has a
rewards credit card
that opens up a world of possibilities. With Venture X, you earn unlimited double miles on everything you buy and get access to over 1,000 airport lounges worldwide. Capital One, what's in your wallet?
All right. I'm pissed. I'm annoyed. I'm so annoyed that whenever I embed an image into PowerPoint, I'm trying to save all of us some time here, that I get hit with ads, even though I have an ad blocker installed in Google Chrome. That's how I got around it. So don't listen to Capital One. That's not an official endorsement by me. But the guy that you're going to see here, whose hands you see here, Joshua Foer, he is the guy who wrote Moonwalking with Einstein. That was a book I recommended at the very beginning of the last video. Basically, this guy's deal is he is a journalist. He is not a genius, and he covered the Memory Olympics for the US, and that's where he realized, like, oh, these people aren't like mega scholars. They're not like, you know, savants who were born, you know, with a fancy brain. They're all just regular people who have like found these strategies for remembering things. And so he spent an entire year learning those strategies, went to the US Memory Olympics, and then won the US title, and then went on to compete at the international level. So what he's going to show you is kind of how he would tackle, or how you can tackle, remembering the first 100 digits of pi. So that's what you're looking at right here. That's really hard to do, right? It's hard to remember 7 digits, right? Let alone 100 digits. So there's a couple of different ways you could do this. You could turn it into a song if you wanted to, but I think that this way will work for you. So as we go through this, don't worry too much about the numbers. Just worry about the images. That's what I want you to worry about and focus on while he walks through this. So I'm going to let this play out. It's going to be about 3 minutes long. So grab some snacks. I'm going to be grabbing a coffee, and then we'll watch this together, and then we'll talk about it.
And the first 100 digits of pi. I'm going to show you how the Memory Palace works so that you can memorize the first 100 digits of pi. So you can't just memorize 100 digits of a random number. Most of us are just not going to be able to do that. The technique that I use is called the major system. So using this code, you can convert any number into a word and then into an image that you can visualize in your Memory Palace. 41. 4 is an R, 1 is a T or a D. Could be RT, rat. 5272. L, N, K, N, Lincoln. 820271001427, 8239407232031227.
All right, he was showing off with that last piece right there, and this is a great picture to catch him on. He was showing off at that end piece right there, but the point is that you can do all of that decoding at the end. That really, it's more helpful to think about rat or to think about Lincoln than it is to think about the individual numbers or letters that make up those images.
So what we're going to do with pi is break this number up into 3-digit chunks and come up with a unique image for each chunk. 141, d, could be a druid. 592, l, b, n, a Libyan, like somebody from Libya. Maybe it's Muammar Gaddafi. 653, sh, l, m. Could be somebody shouting, Shalom! So basically, these 33 images are the first 100 digits of pi. Now let's go to my Memory Palace. So now I picture myself standing outside the Memory Palace, and there's the druid chilling on the front lawn. And then I walk through the door into the house, into a living room, and there's Gaddafi sitting on the yellow sofa. Right next to him, a little midget shouting, Shalom! We turn the corner of the coffee table, and there is a wolf peeing on the nice laminate floor. Right above him, there is a picture going kaboom! And then just beneath that is a nymph, 238, sitting cross-legged on the floor. We're passing from the living room into the bedroom, and right there on the left, 462, a Russian doll. next to the Russian doll, piping hot falafel filled with shawarma. On the bed, MFM, male, female, male, pornographic scenes. And hanging from the wall, big, bony kneecap.
And then I walk into the bathroom. It's a beautiful bathroom. There's Wilson.
The volleyball from Castaway.
He's sitting on the toilet.
Inside the shower is going to be Michelle Pfeiffer. Then on a coffee table, a little bathroom reading, top, a book. And then 169 on the wall, a Toshiba logo. Next to that, 399, male pattern baldness.
I walk into the kitchen and there's Michael Jackson moonwalking across the laminate floor. And next to him, a humming diesel motor. And then on the wall, there are these phones that are buzzing, and in front of them, a baker. I can smell the bread baking in the oven. And in front of him is a barrier. I'm gonna lift up that barrier and walk into the hallway. It's Muammar Gaddafi again. And behind him, a Lucha Libre mask. A pair of red high-heeled leather dominatrix boots, a horseshoe, a no fishing sign, an unsafe sign, a big bottle of cheap Popov vodka, and there I see an ocean view. And then I walk outside of the house into the backyard. It's summer, and behind that, a funnel, and Helen Mirren, and then 117, a fish riding a bicycle. I don't know, because that's idiotic. 067, Pat Sajak, the host from Wheel of Fortune. And that's my memory palace. That's how I visualize the first 100 digits of pi.
Okay, so now let's see if I can actually do this.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it because you know that he's going to get it. You know that he's going to do it right. But the thing that and I know this feels overwhelming, but what I want you to do is to think about the images of that house. And so I think it might be, normally when I do this in the classroom, I take a quick pause, I let everybody kind of write down as many of those images as they can. Don't worry about the spelling, just write down what images, and if you can get the order, all the better. So I think, if you want to try this, pause the video, write down as many of those images as you can, and I'll check back with you in 2 seconds. Okay, so hopefully you paused. If you didn't, that's okay. But what you can do then is, like, if you wrote down, for example, Druid, because that was the first thing that I saw, Druid, the consonants are DRD. So we can look now at this list and say, like, okay, well, that's 1, R is 4, and 1. So we got 3.141, and then what was next, right? If we go back, once we open the door,
standing outside the memory palace, and there's the druid chilling on the front lawn. And then I walk through the door into the house, into a living room, and
then we got Muammar Gaddafi, who is a Libyan. And again, you don't have to remember the vowels, just the hard consonant sounds, the LBN. And so then going back and looking over at this, we can say, like, okay, L is 5, B, where is B? That's a 9, and then an N, that's a 2, so we can say 3.141592, right? So just on those two images, that already got us, right? That got us like 6 digits in. Instead of taking 6 numbers and remembering those individually, now we have 2 images that are much easier to remember, because then after that, then we have Shalom, then we got the wolf peeing, then we got the kaboom, then we got the nymph, then we got the Russian shawarma, then we got the Russian nesting dolls, then shawarma, then MFM, then kneecap, and then what comes after that? There's something before the bathroom, if I recall, and then we go into the bathroom, and you got Wilson on the toilet, right? And then you got Michelle Pfeiffer in the shower, and then you got Topic, and then you got Toshiba, and you got no pattern baldness, and then you move into the next room and it's Michael Jackson, and you got a diesel motor humming, and then you got phones behind him, and then you got a baker, and then you have a barrier, and then you have Muammar Gaddafi again, Libyan, then you have the mask, and then you have the boots, the fetish boots, and then you have the horseshoe, and then you have the no fishing sign, and then you have I feel like I'm forgetting one, but then you have the Popov vodka, then you have the ocean view, then you go outside, it's summer, funnel, Helen Mirren, idiotic, Pat Sajak, and that's all 100. So you're so like I know that this seems tough, But I think if you write down those images of what you remember, then you can go through and decode, just like I did. I tried to walk through and remember what all those pieces were. If I can remember what those images are, then I can go back and then kind of decode what that is. And that's what all these memory champions do. They make it look really fast because they've been doing this for years maybe, but it's something that you can do too. And it is a little bit of work up front, but can definitely help you out if you were trying to remember all of like the periodic table of elements, for example. Okay, so where do memories go? All right, so I guess the last thing that I'll mention about this is that, just give it a try. I was going to try to leave you with something profound, but I'm itching to get into long-term memory discussions because I am looking at time and I do not want this to be as long as last video. So where do our memories go? When we forget information, what happens to that stuff? It really depends on who you are asking, because there are some big disagreements in the field about this. Most people will agree that there are two sources in which we forget information. One is what's called decay. And with decay, what happens is that we lose those memories over time because they are weakened and we can't access them. And the biological explanation for how this occurs is that neurons will die off, the connections between them are pruned away because they're not being used, and so they kind of fade with time, and maybe they gradually die off or those connections are lost. So that is decay. That's what most people kind of think about whenever they're thinking about like forgetting stuff, like that memory just faded away. The other is interference. And interference is this notion that the memories that we have can be overwritten, and they can actually overwrite other memories. So that the memories that we have can kind of get in the way of each other. And the biological explanation for this is if you have neurons that are constantly rewiring, that some of those neurons are going to get stronger, some are going to get weaker, and some are going to forge new connections. And so we might have like one memory that's not super strong, and then we have this new memory, and that new memory is so strong that it essentially takes up the connections of the other memory. That's an example of interference in action. We'll talk more about those in chapter 8, but I wanted to put them on your radar because generally, even though most people do agree that these two are taking place, how much is which is kind of hotly contested. The lab that I graduated from was a hardcore interference lab. The people that I worked with were like every kind of explanation for memory issues kind of boiled back down to interference, and proactive interference and retroactive interference. And there are other people that are just the opposite, that see the things just as decay. But I think just like with bottom-up and top-down processing, or when we talk about like nature versus nurture, that is kind of a mixture of both of these things that are happening. I already mentioned the priming example, but I wanted to put this back on your radar, the word stem completion task. Because do you remember... Actually, sorry, I'm fast forwarding for a second. I want you to try to remember that list of words from chapter 1, the very first list that we looked at, and the one that we used the word stem completion on. Do you remember that list of words? There were 15 of them. How many of those 15 do you remember? Probably not so many, right? But if I showed you this, does that help? Now that I'm looking at this, I may have remembered like 4 or 5, but now I remember, oh yeah, moth, supreme, I think this is crayon, banner, mantle, calzone, personality, textbook, nightly, wagging, justice, avast, fractured stamina, gloves. Dang, I got all of them. Which means that when I was looking at this right here, and I was kind of struggling to ask myself, like, I don't know if I remember any of those words really. And now whenever I saw these word stems, now all of a sudden I can remember them. So what does that mean about that memory? Where was that memory? Basically, I think that this shows us that it's not that we lost that information, that this information was somewhere in our heads, We just lost the ability to access that information. And this is also true if you think about that memory palace example with the first 100 digits of pi. There's a good chance that usually when I'm in the class, like when I'm in the classroom doing that activity, most people are like, I don't remember any of that stuff. But then once I start talking about like, okay, well, imagine Michael Jackson moonwalking through that kitchen. What was behind him? Then they'll say like, oh, I guess a diesel engine. Okay. And then what did you hear after that? Phones. Okay. And who was picking up the phone? A baker or a chef. And so in that case, what we're looking at there is those individuals thought they forgot those images, but with a little prompting, they were able to recall them. So it's not that they had forgotten that information, it's that they had lost the ability to retrieve that information. And then when they were supplied with the correct retrieval cue, such as these word stems, it allows you to remember, like, oh yeah, I do remember this information. And also, there's a good chance that as I was reading through some of them, maybe you forgot personality, but then when I said personality, you're like, oh yeah, I do remember that. That's an example of exactly what I'm talking about. You remembered it, so it was in your brain somewhere, and it wasn't until you had the exact item to help you retrieve it that you were like, oh yeah, I do remember that now. So it's not that we lose the ability to retrieve that information, it's not that we lose that information, it's that we lose the ability to retrieve that information. I just want to show you this figure right here because I was talking about it very briefly at the end of last video, but to show you in that Meyer and Schadenvelt study that the difference for these words, that whenever the two words are related, that it provides about a 200 millisecond increase in processing speed compared to when they aren't. All right, so now what we're going to be looking at for the rest of this video mostly is looking at implicit memory. So far, a lot of what we've been talking about is explicit memory for things that we can talk about, we can put into words, because we're talking about mnemonics, and we're talking about things that we need to talk about to put into words so that we can retrieve them. So a lot of that has been general knowledge, right? Things that help you study, things that help you retrieve trivia and encyclopedic facts and things you might need to know for an exam, or things that occurred to you that you might want to remember that happened to you. But now we're going to be talking a little bit about implicit memory. So let's get into that. All right, so let's talk about the hippocampus in order to do that. So when we are talking about the hippocampus is going to help us store memories. You can think of it as, I think of it really as kind of like a train station where all of your different senses are going to be helping you encode all this information and pull it into your brain, and then from there, if you're paying attention to it, that information is going to go to the hippocampus. Once it's there, the hippocampus is then going to help distribute it throughout the cortex. So the hippocampus is not just somewhere that really stores up a lot of information and details and facts and knowledge. Really what it does is it takes that information and then picks places in the brain where it can be stored reliably in the long term. This area is really, really sensitive to new places. So when we are in a new place, we generally recognize like, oh, I haven't been here before, right? That's a common experience that we have when we walk into somewhere new. It's not as common that we walk into a place and we're like, oh, I haven't been here before. And then you walk around for like 5 minutes and you're like, oh, you know what? I have been here before. We don't have that sensation nearly as much as we do when we're like watching TV or listening to a podcast, when we're like, oh yeah, actually I have listened to this before. And that's because our hippocampus is really, really sensitive to new places and new experiences. So it is part of the medial temporal lobe. And in order to talk about the hippocampus, I want to tell you a little bit about this guy whose code name was HM. So HM, the HM stands for Henry Molaison. People didn't know that for a long time because Henry Molaison was kind of like, this was his code name. And he was named this because a lot of research was published about this guy while he was alive. And so they didn't want to dox him. They didn't want to blow up his spot and let everybody know who he was. So to protect his identity, he went by his initials. And he was involved in surgery gone wrong, essentially. That back in the day, I want to say this was sort of been in the 60s, he had really severe epilepsy, and basically it was kind of like medication wasn't working, treatment wasn't working, so, final desperate, kind of strategy, we're going to go in there and we're going to remove his hippocampus. We're going to take out that hippocampus. And what that does, taking out a hippocampus, is, well, they didn't know. Like, this was before we knew that it was involved with memory to the degree that it is. So they took out this area of his brain. They actually took out, I think, his whole medial temporal lobe in order to do that. And he survived. He lived. He seemed to have a mostly happy life after that. But there was a huge change in his behavior, which is that he could no longer create a new memory. So he spent the rest of his life essentially unable to remember that he had ever had that surgery to begin with. That's wild to imagine, right? And as you can see, he lived for decades. He lived for like 40 years later after his surgery, and he never created a memory that he consciously remembered. So this leads us to a discussion about amnesia, because there's a lot of different kinds of amnesia. HM is the most studied amnesiac ever. He's had many publications about him, and I just want to shout out the researcher responsible for this, because everyone knows him, and the person who worked with him for years, also for decades. Her name was Brenda Milner. And so whenever people talk about this distinction of explicit memory versus implicit memory, we talk about Brenda Milner, because she was the neuropsychologist who was around, that worked with him in his, because basically, he can't remember anything now. He had to basically live with an assisted living for the rest of his days, and so she was kind of the person who was kind of in charge of his treatment and his care for a long time, and worked with him a lot. So after this occurred, he was unable to create these new memories, and this is known as anterograde amnesia. So anterograde amnesia, and we're going to talk about what the other version of that is as well. Anterograde basically means that you can't create new memories, new long-term memories. Another example of this that's maybe a little more recent is a guy named Clive Waring. Clive Waring, he lost his hippocampus due to, I want to say it was untreated. Actually, I don't remember. It was an STI, though. It was either gonorrhea or syphilis, if I recall. But it was some totally like freak accident where he had this STI, didn't know about it, went untreated, and he got sick, and it destroyed his hippocampus and other parts of his medial temporal lobe, just like HM. So there wasn't like a surgical mishap. And this guy was like the composer for the royal family in England. Like, he was like this big deal as a composer, and he like had this freak accident, and here is a video. Probably gonna get an advertisement, right? Nope. We didn't get an advertisement. I'm going to put on subtitles here because he is very British, and it can be a little bit hard to hear what he has to say. But this comes from a longer documentary that you can find. It's an hour-long, very, very interesting stuff. But I'm not going to play the whole thing for you, but I do want to play parts of this for you so that we can talk about it.
One man is consigned to live entirely within the present, with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory, and sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence.
I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently
Oh, I see.
in New Zealand.
Ah.
and so they're having a party.
Funny how the ladies acquire different title when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know?
Mm.
Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married in. Do you know what country she just got married in?
No, I don't.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question and he'll give you an answer, but while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is.
I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You want to see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to now?
No.
Guess what you think they're up to.
No idea, I couldn't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They hadn't got an O-level last time I was conscious. So I didn't know what possible thing they could do, did I?
No.
No, I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No idea. I don't know where I am.
No.
All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before. Never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive. Day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time. Oh, look, she's come.
Okay, all right. So how cute is that, right? That like it's extremely tragic that he's got this condition that limits his memory, but he does remember something, right? He remembers his wife, and and so this brings up a lot of really interesting questions, right? That he recognizes his wife, but he can't create new memories. So why is it that when he sees his wife, he doesn't totally freak out and say like, "Oh my God, Deborah, you look 30 years younger, 30 years older than I just remember seeing you," right? Because that would be his first memory in 30 years is that she looks totally different, than she did, as we all do, But so he's able to remember something, right? He's also able to remember language. And as we saw at the very beginning here, he's playing piano, and he's holding place playing piano. So something is kind of funny about this, right? So seems like maybe not all memories are created equal, that some of them maybe are affected by the hippocampus being gone, but maybe not all of them. So here is a really fun example that you can try. This is the mirror tracing task. I put this on Brightspace, so you can try this at home if you like. So basically you can choose one of these shapes and you click on it. So I don't know if this will work all that well with a tablet or with your phone, but you're supposed to basically just kind of try to draw within the line on this, and you click when you get there, and it keeps track of your time for that. And then you're supposed to do the whole thing, but now the controls are reversed. So you can see I'm struggling with this. I'm really having a hard time keeping it in the lines. Oh my gosh, this is bad, y'all. But anyways, I just gave up. So this mirror tracing task is used a lot for individuals with memory deficits, because what they found about HM and about Clive Waring is that with practice, they get better at this. So that presents kind of an interesting question, right? So they get better at doing this task, but they have no memory of doing it. So that must mean that this kind of behavior that we're seeing here is not a memory that is really managed by a hippocampus. So there are some memories that are not really consolidated with the help of the hippocampus the same way that others are. So this is what a lot of the stuff that Brenda Milner worked on with HM was looking at stuff like this. And one kind of famous example of his case study, the nurses that lived with HM taught him how to ride a bike on the weekends. But before his surgery, he had never learned to ride a bike. So when they would ask him on the weekend, like, "Hey, Henry, do you want to ride your bike?" He would say, I've never ridden a bike before. I don't know how I would be able to. And they put him up on the bike, and he would just do it. And he would have no memory of it. He'd be like, I don't know how to ride a bike. How am I doing this? So this tells us that there are two separate memory systems. One that is explicit, memories that we can see and say, that we can put into words, that we can talk about, and memories that we can act on, memories that guide our behavior that we can't easily put into words. So the different kinds of amnesia here, before we get into that distinction of implicit versus explicit, the different kinds of amnesia to know. The first is anterograde amnesia. That's what we just talked about. This is where you lose your ability to create new memories. So you can't take memories from your short-term storage and move them into long-term storage, because the hippocampus, which is that train station that usually facilitates that, is no longer around to be able to do that. Retrograde amnesia is a little bit more common, or it's a lot more common actually, and this is what we normally think about whenever we think about amnesia. This is usually created by serious head trauma. So any kind of damage to the brain, any kind of like concussion maybe, can result in losing information from right before that accident. And usually the more severe the accident, the more profound the memory loss in that regard. And usually it's going to be for episodic memory. We'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but you may remember that from last video as well. Korsakoff syndrome, this is usually due to chronic alcoholism, but it can also, and sometimes people will call this like wet brain syndrome, where because of chronic alcoholism, individuals are unable to create new memories. All right, a couple of movies. These are both old by your standards, I'm sure, but they're recent-ish movies. Got a Adam Sandler comedy that talks about anterograde amnesia. It is completely unrealistic because basically Drew Barrymore and him, they are dating. However, whenever she goes to sleep, when she wakes up, her memory is new every single day. So for her, it's the same day, new day every single day. That's not really how anterograde amnesia works. It's a fun movie. It's very cute. You should watch it with your significant other if you're looking for a nice little fun romantic comedy. But it's this other movie, Memento, is much more accurate for anterograde amnesia. This is a mystery thriller about a guy who experiences really tough brain injury, and as a result cannot create new memories, but he is dead set on finding his wife's killer, and so he tattoos himself and like writes these messages on his arms in tattoo ink to like remind him what his name is and like what he's meant to be doing and the clues of his wife's murderer. This is the guy who he would go on to direct Oppenheimer and The Dark Knight and Inception and all those movies that you love. But this is kind of what put him on the radar. Good movie, worth watching, especially if you're a psych major, because it has a really good kind of depiction of anterograde amnesia, and it's just kind of it's a good movie. So what this tells us is that not all memories are equal. That we saw Clive Wearing able to play piano. So that tells us that maybe something about performing instruments and making music is not really the same as remembering a conversation. And this brings us to implicit and explicit memory. So people that have amnesia are generally going to have deficits in a specific kind of memory. And those are the ones that are autobiographical. Those are the ones that require conscious thought, like things that we talk about in conversation, basic trivia, things like that. But they don't seem to have any problem with tasks that don't require explicit thought. So like playing a guitar, for example. If Clive Wearing got into an accident, and actually this is kind of a fun example using a guitar where like I can play, but if you asked me, how'd you do that? What were you playing? I gotta stop and think. This was a D, this was a C modified, and so what I'm doing there is I'm taking an implicit memory, playing an instrument, something that is kind of automatic, and I'm converting that into something that I can talk about. I'm converting it into an explicit memory in that case. And that's where we can see a lot of people have a lot of mishaps. For example, like if you are dancing, if you're like a dancer and you are practicing and you get into your head about it, it's going to mess you up. And you'll probably find that like your dancing is best when you're not thinking really, where you're just kind of vibing, where you're just kind of in that flow state, as they call it. Because then you're just working on implicit memory and you don't have to worry about explicit memory getting in the way. You don't have to worry about that conscious recall getting in the way. So the word stem completion task and priming, those examples that we talked about earlier as a way to look at long-term memory, those use implicit memory to help us recall information. So amnesiacs are generally, especially interrogator amnesiacs, are generally not able to consciously recall their experience, but they can still show evidence of it. And this is true for both anterograde and retrograde and amnesiacs. This is a cool example looking at two individuals, one that has damage in their amygdala, so this is the area responsible for fear processing or emotional processing, and then one that had damage in the hippocampus. And what they found is that for fear responses, that the guy who had damage in his amygdala showed no difference in his skin conductance response whenever he was given a fearful stimulus, but controls were, and the individual who did not have a hippocampus did too. So the guy that did not have a hippocampus showed a fear response just like a control participant. But whenever they were given something, given an explicit memory task, just the opposite. That guy without a hippocampus did miserably. He didn't remember anything. But the guy that did not have a hippocampus did just as well as the controls do, which show us that the hippocampus is responsible for explicit memory, but doesn't really impact our implicit memory. So let me give you an example of this task. If I were to ask you, can you complete this word stem? How would you do? When I show this in the classroom, most people kind of struggle with it. Okay, so if I were to ask some amnesiacs about this, they would say, yeah, I don't know. And then if I were to show this to a control subject, they would also say, yeah, I don't know, I can't figure it out. Okay, fine. Now what I want you to do in this next task is to remember these 5 objects. So take a second to look at them and to try to remember them. All right, now if I asked you, what were the 5 images that you saw? Someone that had amnesia, interrogator amnesia, would look at them and say, like, I don't recall. I don't remember any of them. But you do have your hippocampus intact. You would say, I saw a clown, I saw a cat, I saw a bottle of chocolate drink, I saw an elephant, and I saw a stop sign. Now, if I bring back this word stem task and I ask you, can you complete this word stem? You have just been primed, right? So you have been primed, and because of that, you know what this is. Because something from your past is going to immediately impact your ability to recall this, and you're going to say, oh, that's the word elephant, right? So you would say that's the word elephant, and the person that had interrogator amnesia, they would say, oh, it's elephant. So here's a really cool example of implicit memory and how mysterious it is. That in this case, both of you are using that elephant that you saw in that prior case to help you solve this task. Because you couldn't do it before, you can do it now. And you know why too, because you saw an elephant in the previous slide. That interrogate amnesia patient, like Clive Waring or AHM, they wouldn't remember seeing the elephant, but they would be able to solve this. And if I asked them, how'd you know that? They would not know. They would not be able to explain why. So this shows us that there are separate and independent memory systems. One that is explicit, that's kind of guided by the hippocampus, that is formed around things that we can vocalize and put into words, and one that is implicit. One that is not really guided by the hippocampus, but is guided by other areas of the brain that are responsible for those behaviors. Sometimes we break this down into declarative memory as like knowledge of things that you can vocalize, and non-declarative, so things that you can't. But we usually just kind of talk about them as the same. Like explicit is declarative, implicit is non-declarative. Episodic is a form of explicit memory, and I wanted to touch on it just a little bit because this is I know we already talked about it in the previous chapter, but this is the form of memory that is most kind of damaged by individuals that have amnesia. So memory for autobiographical events, these are the ones that are kind of impacted. For like if you got into an accident on the football field, or whatever, you bumped your head and you lost out on some recent memories, you might not be able to remember like what you had for breakfast, right? If it's a really, really severe case, you might not be able to remember where you went to high school, but most people are usually able to remember that. But those autobiographical events are the ones that we forget. We don't forget things like how to speak. We don't forget how to play an instrument. We don't forget how to play football from that, because those are different areas of the brain, different memory system altogether. I wanted to highlight again this debate about episodic memory and about whether or not it is uniquely human or not. Actually, I don't know if I actually went into too much yeah, I did talk about this actually. But Chaser is a dog who has an extremely huge vocabulary, and I'll let you decide if this is episodic memory or not. I don't know, kind of interesting to think about. So, last thing I want to mention is how can we apply this to our daily lives, like what we learned here. So, one is if we are going to study, thinking ahead of time about your study locations can be helpful. If you know that you are going to be taking the exam somewhere different, then it can be helpful to study in multiple locations. And the reason for that is that if you study in lots of different locations, then you are ensuring that your memories are not tied to that specific environmental context. So it might actually be harder at first to do this, but the results of it are going to be more enduring and are going to last longer. Your long-term memory is going to be better. But if you can't do that, then be consistent. If you're consistent, then this can be helpful because, for example, if you always chew the same flavor gum, you listen to the same playlist, you're in the same kind of room whenever you're studying, then employ those same things whenever you are retrieving that information, because you can now use those individual things as retrieval cues for that memory. When you can, try using mental rehearsal. So we talked a little bit about how like your the study state, the closer it is to the retrieval state, the easier it is to retrieve things. So think about that whenever you're taking an exam. Walk through, like, where was I when I was learning about this? You know, like, what was the classroom like? What was the conditions like? Going through that might help you. Or even if you're thinking about, like, oh, I pulled an all-nighter and I studied in the library. Think about that library. Think about how that library smelled. Think about, you know, if you had coffee with you, if you had anybody else there with you, what you talked about and things like that. And then finally, make it relevant to yourself. And this is the part that's kind of hard. This is where you can use mnemonics as well. But making it relevant to yourself does require you to slow down. It does require you to like methodologically kind of like ask yourself, how is this relevant to me? How can I use this in the real world? Have I experienced this before? Why is this important? Those kind of follow-up questions are really, really going to help you on an exam because they ensure that you're encoding it at a really deep level, at that semantic level of processing. And using mnemonics like the master system or the major system, the PEG system, where you're using the memory palace to kind of walk through, that can also be helpful because you're taking those really vivid images and you're pairing them with information that's otherwise dull and hard to remember. So you're making it relevant to you, which means that it'll stay with you longer. That's all that I want to talk about with you. Thank you so much for hanging with me. Sorry that this video went on for so long, but I hope that maybe some of this was helpful for you, that you can use some of this stuff in your daily life and that you feel empowered to do so, and that you check out the movie Memento because it's a pretty good movie and relevant for you as a psychology major. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, drop it in the comments or whatever, and I will see you later. Bye, everybody.